In the year 1871, in a quiet and forgotten part of Mississippi, there was a road that most people refused to take. It was not marked on any official map. It did not lead to any town, and no one who lived nearby had a reason to travel down it, unless they were willing to ignore the stories. The road itself was old, older than most of the buildings in the county. It had once been a plantation road, wide enough for wagons, strong enough for heavy loads of cotton, and busy enough that dust would rise into the air from morning until evening. But by 1871, that road had changed. Grass had begun to grow through the cracks in the dirt. The edges were lined with wild trees that had not been cut in years. Broken fence posts leaned to one side, as if they had simply grown tired of standing. And at the very end of that road, there was a cabin. It was small, built from dark wood that had faded over time. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, and one side of the porch had collapsed completely. The windows were covered, not broken, not open, but covered from the inside, as if someone had taken the time to make sure no one could look in. And the door was always closed. Not just closed, locked. People in the nearby town had a name for that place. They didn't call it by the name of the family who once lived there. Most of them had already forgotten that. Instead, they called it something much simpler, the closed cabin. Because no one had opened that door in 40 years. If you are drawn to forgotten stories, hidden truths, and dark chapters of history, then subscribe to Shadows of History. Because here, every story hides something the world tried to forget. The story of the cabin was not something people spoke about openly. It was the kind of story that came out slowly, in quiet conversations, late at night, or when someone new asked the wrong question. If a traveler passed through the town and asked about the old plantation road, someone would eventually warn them, "Don't go down that road," they would say. And if the traveler asked why, there would usually be a pause. Not because people didn't know the answer, but because no one was quite sure which part of the story was true and which part had been changed over time. Some would say the cabin had been locked by the owner himself. Others would say it had been locked from the outside by someone else. Some said the people inside had died suddenly. Others said they never left at all. And then there were those who said something even stranger. They said that the cabin was not just closed. It was meant to stay closed. The truth was no one really knew. But everyone agreed on one thing. No one went near it. Even the children in town knew about the cabin. They dared each other to walk halfway down the road, but no one ever made it all the way to the end. The trees seemed to grow thicker the farther you went, and the air felt different there, heavier, quieter, as if the sound of the outside world did not belong. Older people would tell them to stay away, not in a loud or angry way, but in a quiet, serious tone that made it clear this was not a story meant for games. There are places, one old man once said, that are better left alone. The cabin was one of those places. But the story of the cabin did not begin in 1871. By the time people were warning others to stay away, the cabin had already been closed for decades. To understand why it remained locked, to understand why no one opened that door, you had to go back to a time when the road was still alive, when wagons moved along it every day, when voices filled the air, and when the cabin was not a mystery, but a home. Long before the road became quiet, the land it sat on had been part of a large plantation, the kind of plantation that stretched across acres of land, with fields that seemed endless and buildings that were built to last. The main house had stood on a hill not far from the road, and smaller structures had been built across the land, barns, storage houses, and cabins for workers and families who lived there. The cabin at the end of the road had been one of those, but it was different from the others. It was placed farther away, closer to the trees, closer to the edge of the property, as if it had been built for someone who was meant to stay, but also meant to be separate. People who remembered those days would later say that the cabin had always felt different, even when it was new, even when people lived inside it. There was something about its location, its distance, its silence. But at the time, no one paid much attention, because the plantation was busy. And busy places do not leave much room for questions. Life moved quickly. Work began before sunrise and ended after sunset. People had responsibilities, routines, and expectations. And in a place like that, A small cabin at the edge of the property did not stand out. Until one day, it did. By 1871, the plantation itself was no longer what it had once been. Like many others in Mississippi, it had begun to decline after the war. The economy had changed, the system that supported it had collapsed, and many plantations had either been abandoned or broken into smaller pieces of land. The main house near the road was already in poor condition. Parts of it had been left empty, and the land around it was no longer maintained the way it once had been. But even as the plantation changed, even as buildings were left to fall apart, the cabin at the end of the road remained exactly the same. Closed, untouched, unchanged. That was the part people could not understand. Other buildings had been opened, cleared, and reused. But not that one. No one claimed it. No one repaired it. And no one entered it. There were no signs on the door. No warnings written anywhere. Just a lock. Old, rusty, but still in place. As if someone many years ago had closed that door with a purpose and expected it to remain closed forever. Travelers who ignored the warnings and walked far enough down the road would eventually see it. The cabin would appear slowly through the trees, its shape becoming clearer with each step. At first, it would look like any other old building, but the closer they got, the more they would notice things that did not feel right. There were no footprints near the door, no signs of animals going in or out, no broken windows that no damage that suggested anyone had tried to force their way inside. It was not abandoned in the way most buildings were abandoned. It was sealed, and that made it different, because abandoned places are usually empty. This place did not feel empty. It felt closed, as if something had been left inside and was meant to stay there. Most people who saw it for the first time did not stay long. They would look at the door, the windows, the silence around it, and then turn back. Not because they saw something, but because they felt something. Something that told them this was not a place they were supposed to be. And over time, that feeling became part of the story. Years passed, then decades, and still, no one opened the door. The lock remained. The windows remained covered. The cabin remained exactly as it had been left. And with each passing year, the story grew. People added details, changed details, forgot details. But the center of the story never changed. A cabin at the end of an old plantation road that had been closed for 40 years, and no one knew why. Some said it was because of what happened inside. Others said it was because of what was found. And a few said something even more unsettling. They said the reason no one opened the cabin was because the people who knew the truth had made sure it stayed closed. But that truth, whatever it was, had not disappeared. It was still there, waiting, behind a door that had not been opened since the day it was locked. And that is where the story begins, long before the cabin became something people feared, before it became a story whispered in low voices, before it became a place no one would go near. It was just a home, a small one, quiet, isolated, but still a home. The people who lived there were not wealthy. They were not important. Their names were never written in any official record that survived long enough to matter. And over time, even the people in the nearby town forgot what they were called. But they remembered this much. There were 3 of them, a man, a woman, and a young girl. They lived at the far edge of the plantation, away from the main house, away from the road, away from everything that made the rest of the land feel alive. No one ever clearly explained why they lived so far from the others. Some said the man worked a job that required him to stay near the tree line, cutting wood, watching the edge of the property, fixing fences where the forest began. Others said the family preferred to stay alone, and a few believed something else entirely, that the family had been placed there, not by choice, but for a reason no one spoke about openly. Still, in the early years, nothing about their life seemed unusual. The man was known to come into town once or twice a month. He did not speak much, but he paid for what he needed and left without causing trouble. He bought simple things, flour, tools, cloth. Nothing more than what a small family required. The woman was rarely seen, but when she was, people remembered her as quiet and watchful. She did not linger, did not talk, did not draw attention to herself. And the girl, people remembered the girl, because she was the only one who seemed different. Not in a way that made people afraid, but in a way that made people curious. She was young, no more than 8 or 9 years old when people first noticed her. She had a habit of looking at things longer than most children did, as if she was trying to understand something no one else could see. Sometimes, when her father came into town, she would be with him. She never spoke. Not to anyone. Not even when someone spoke directly to her. She would simply stand beside him, holding his hand, her eyes moving quietly from one person to another. Some people thought she was shy. Others thought she had been told not to speak. And a few believed something else, that she could not speak at all. But no one ever asked directly, because even then, there was something about that family that made people careful. Careful about what they said. Careful about what they asked. Careful about how long they looked. Life on the plantation continued as it always had. Work filled the days. The seasons passed. And the family in the cabin lived quietly at the edge of it all. Rarely seen. Rarely heard. But then, slowly, something began to change. At first, it was small. The man came into town less often. Then he stopped coming altogether. The woman was not seen anymore. And the girl. No one saw her again. At first, people did not think much of it. Families came and went on plantations. People moved. People disappeared. Life was uncertain, and not every absence was a mystery. But weeks passed. Then months. And still no one from the cabin came into town. That was when people began to notice. The blacksmith mentioned it first. "That man hasn't been here in a long time," he said one afternoon. Someone else nodded. "Neither has the little girl." Another man spoke up. "They still living out there?" No one had an answer. A few days later, a man who worked near the edge of the plantation said he had passed by the road that led to the cabin. "I didn't go all the way," he said, "but I didn't see any smoke from the chimney." That was strange. Even the smallest cabin needed a fire, for cooking, for warmth, for life. No smoke meant no fire, and no fire meant something was wrong. A few men decided to walk part of the way down the road, to see for themselves. They did not go all the way. Even then, something about that road made people hesitate. But they went far enough to see the cabin in the distance. And what they saw was not what they expected. The cabin was still there, standing, unchanged. But there was no movement, no sound, no smoke, no sign that anyone was living inside. One of the men said they should go closer. Another said they should leave it alone. They stood there for a moment, arguing quietly, neither willing to take the first step forward. Finally, one of them walked a few steps ahead, just enough to get a clearer look. Then he stopped. "There's something on the door," he said. The others stepped closer. Not too close, just enough to see. And then they saw it too. The door was closed, and there was a lock on it. Not a loose one, not a broken one. A solid, deliberate lock, placed on the outside. For a long moment, no one spoke, because that one detail changed everything. If the lock had been on the inside, it would have meant the family had closed themselves in. But the lock was on the outside, which meant someone had closed the door. After, one of the men stepped forward again, slowly this time, as if the ground itself might give way beneath him. He reached out and touched the lock. It was cold, still, unmoved. "This wasn't done by accident," he said quietly. The others did not reply, because they already knew. Someone had locked that door, and whoever had done it had not come back. They did not open the cabin that day. No one suggested it. No one tried, because opening that door meant facing whatever was inside. And in that moment, not knowing felt safer than knowing. They turned around and walked back toward the road, back toward the town, back toward the part of the world that still made sense. But the story had already begun. Within days, everyone in the area knew. The family in the cabin had disappeared. The door had been locked from the outside, and no one knew who had done it or why. Some said the family had left, and someone had locked the cabin afterward, but that did not explain why no one had seen them leave. Others said something had happened inside, and the door had been locked to keep people out or to keep something in. And then there were those who believed something darker. They believed the family had never left at all, that whatever had happened inside that cabin, and that the lock on the door was not to protect the outside world from the cabin, but to protect the cabin from the outside world. As days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, No one came forward to claim the cabin. No relatives. No owners. No explanation. The plantation itself began to decline not long after, and attention slowly shifted to other problems, other concerns, other losses. But the cabin remained, closed, locked, silent, and with each passing year, the memory of the family began to fade. Their names were forgotten, their faces blurred in memory. Their voices, if they had ever been heard, disappeared completely, until all that remained was the question: what happened inside that cabin? And why? Did no one ever open the door? Because from that day forward, the cabin was no longer just a home. It was a mystery, one that would remain locked for the next 40 years. By the time people realized the family in the cabin had disappeared, the truth had already begun to slip away. Because whatever had happened had not happened in daylight. It had happened at night. And nights have a way of hiding things, especially in a place like that. In 1871, the land surrounding the old plantation was darker than most people today can imagine. There were no streetlights, no lamps along the roads, no distant glow from nearby towns. When the sun went down, darkness took over completely, and on the road that led to the cabin, that darkness felt deeper, thicker, as if the trees themselves were holding it in place. People who lived nearby would later say that there was one night, one specific night, when something changed. Not slowly, not quietly, but all at once. It began with a storm. Not an unusual storm for Mississippi, but strong enough to keep most people inside. The wind moved through the trees in long, low sounds. Rain struck the ground in steady waves, and thunder rolled across the land in a way that made it impossible to ignore. On nights like that, people stayed close to home. Doors closed, windows shut, lights kept low. But even in a storm, some sounds carry. And that night, some people heard something they would never forget. It started as a distant noise, hard to place. Not quite a voice, not quite the wind, something in between. One man, who lived closer to the edge of the plantation than most, later described it like this: "At first, I thought it was just a storm. But then it came again, and I knew it wasn't." He said it sounded like a scream. Not loud, not long, but sharp enough to cut through the sound of rain and thunder. A human sound, a desperate sound. And it came from the direction of the cabin. The man did not go outside. No one did. Storm or no storm, there are moments when people choose not to move. Moments when instinct tells them to stay where they are, to wait, to listen, and to pretend they did not hear what they just heard. But he was not the only one. Another person, farther down the road, said they saw something through their window that same night. A light. Not lightning, not a reflection, a steady, moving light. Like a lantern. They said it appeared near the tree line and moved slowly, carefully, toward the direction of the cabin. Then it disappeared. Some said it went inside. Others said it vanished before it reached the door. But everyone who heard the story agreed on one thing. There should not have been any light out there. Not that night. Not at that hour. Not in that place. By morning, the storm had passed. The sky was clear again. The land looked exactly the same as it had the day before. But something felt different. People who lived near the plantation said the air felt still, quieter than usual. Even the animals seemed unsettled. And when the day fully began, no one came from the cabin. No smoke from the chimney. No movement near the door. No sign of life. At first, no one connected the storm to the silence. Storms came and went. People stayed inside. That was normal. But as the hours passed, and then the day ended, the silence remained. The next day came. Still nothing. No movement. No smoke. No sound. That was when the memory of the storm began to matter. Because now people started to ask questions. Quietly. Carefully. Did you hear anything that night? Did you see anything? And slowly, the stories began to connect. The scream. The light. The storm. And the cabin. But even then, no one went to the door. Fear does not always look like panic. Sometimes it looks like hesitation. Like waiting one more day. Then one more. Then another. Until the moment to act is past. A few days later, someone finally walked far enough down the road to see the cabin again. They did not go close. But they went close enough. And what they saw confirmed what everyone had begun to suspect. The cabin was sealed. The windows had been covered from the inside. Boards, cloth, something placed carefully to block the view. And the door was closed. Locked. The same lock that would remain there for 40 years. But now, it meant something different. Because now people knew. The family had been inside that cabin, on the night of the storm. And after that night, they were never seen again. That was the moment the story truly began. Before that, the cabin had simply been a place where people lived. Now it became something else. A place where something had happened. Something no one had seen. Something no one could explain. Something that had been left behind, without a witness. In the weeks that followed, the story grew. Some said the scream had been the woman. Others said it had been the child. A few believed it had been the man. But no one could agree. And no one could prove anything. The light became part of the story too. Some said it was someone coming to the cabin. Others said it was someone leaving. And then there were those who said the light had never belonged to a person at all. That had been something else. Something unexplained. Something that did not need a door to enter or leave. Over time, the details began to change, as stories do. But the core remained the same. A storm, a scream, a light, and then silence. What made it worse, what made it stay with people for so long, was not just what had happened. It was what had not happened. No bodies were found. No signs of struggle were seen from a distance. No one came forward with an explanation. And no one opened the door. Because opening that door meant facing the truth. And sometimes, the truth is not something people are ready to see. So the cabin remained closed. Days turned into months. Months turned into years. And the night of the storm became something people spoke about less and less. Not because they forgot, but because remembering made the silence feel heavier. And the cabin stayed exactly the same. The boards remained on the windows. The lock remained on the door. And whatever had happened inside remained inside, waiting for a day that would not come for 40 years. Because the truth, whatever it was still there. Behind that door. Unseen, unspoken, and untouched. Since the night something happened. What do you think happened inside that cabin? Was it a crime, an accident, or something that was never meant to be discovered? Tell me what you think in the comments. For 40 years, the cabin at the end of the plantation road remained closed. Seasons changed. Winters came and went. Storms passed. Trees grew taller. The old plantation land was divided, sold, abandoned, and resold again. But the cabin remained exactly the same. Locked, untouched, avoided. By the time the year 1911 arrived, most of the people who actually remembered the family were gone. Some had died. Some had moved away. And some had simply stopped talking about the story altogether. To the younger generation, the cabin was not a memory. It was a legend, a place their parents told them to stay away from, a place older people refused to speak about for too long, a place at the end of a road that no one used anymore. But in 1911, the land was purchased by a new owner, a man who did not grow up hearing the stories, who did not feel the same fear, and who did not see the cabin as a mystery. He saw it as a building. Old, forgotten, but still standing. And in his mind, anything that stood on his land belonged to him. When he first heard about the cabin, it was not from a story. It was from a worker. There's an old place at the end of the road. The worker told him. Been locked longer than anyone can remember. The new owner asked a simple question. Why? The worker gave the only answer anyone had ever given. No one knows. That answer was not good enough for a man who believed land was something you controlled, not something that scared you. He decided he would go see it himself. The workers did not argue with him, but they did not want to go with him either. Still, a few of them agreed, because saying no directly felt more dangerous than walking down an old road in the daylight. So one morning, the new owner and 3 workers walked down the plantation road together. The road was narrower now than it had been 40 years earlier. Trees had grown inward from both sides, and in some places branches hung so low they had to be pushed aside to continue walking. The farther they went, the quieter it became. No sound of wagons, no sound of animals, only the sound of their own footsteps and the occasional movement of leaves in the wind. After a while, one of the workers stopped walking. "I'll wait here," he said. The others did not laugh at him, because they understood. The new owner looked at him for a moment, then continued walking with the other two men. A few minutes later, they saw it, the cabin, still standing exactly where it had always stood. From a distance, it did not look frightening, just old. But as they got closer, the details became clearer. The porch had partially collapsed. The wood had darkened with age. The windows were still covered from the inside, boards and cloth, now faded and fragile, but still in place. And the door still had the lock. Rust covered most of it now, but it was still holding the door shut. 40 years, and no one had touched it. The new owner walked up to the door and stood there for a moment, looking at the lock, the handle, the wood, as if trying to imagine the last person who had stood in that exact spot. Then he reached out and grabbed the lock. One of the workers spoke quickly. "Sir, maybe we should leave it." The owner did not turn around. "It's just a building," he said. But even he did not open it immediately. Instead, he walked around the cabin slowly, looking at the walls, the windows, the roof. When he reached the back of the cabin, he stopped. "There's no back door," he said. The workers looked at each other. Most cabins had two exits. This one had only one. One door. One way in. One way out. They returned to the front. The owner stood in front of the door again. "This has been closed for 40 years, he said quietly. "Whatever's inside, it's not going to change just because we're standing here." He then gave a simple order. "Break the lock." One of the workers hesitated. Then, slowly, he stepped forward with a hammer. The first echoed louder than expected. Metal against metal. A sharp sound that seemed to disappear into the trees and not come back. He hit it again. And again. On the third strike, the lock broke and fell to the ground. For a moment, no one moved. The door was still closed. But now it was not locked. The owner reached for the handle. He turned it slowly. The door did not open. It was stuck. Not locked. Just stuck. 40 years of dust, with swelling, and time had sealed it shut. "Push," the owner said. The worker pushed once. Nothing. He pushed again, harder this time. The wood made a low, cracking sound. Dust fell from the top of the door frame. "Again," the owner said. The worker pushed with all his weight. And finally, the door opened. Just a few inches at first, then slowly wider. The air that came out of the cabin was cold. Not like winter air. Not like night air. Just cold. Stale, like air that had not moved in a very long time. No one stepped inside immediately. They stood at the door and looked in. At first, it was too dark to see clearly. Then their eyes adjusted, and they realized something that none of them expected. The cabin was not empty. It looked like someone had just left. A table stood in the center of the room. There were dishes on it. A chair had been pulled back, as if someone had stood up quickly and never returned. A bed stood against one wall, covered in what was left of a blanket. A small shelf held a few objects, a lantern, a cup, and something that looked like a book or a journal. Dust covered everything, but nothing looked destroyed. Nothing looked stolen. Nothing looked searched. It looked like a moment that had been frozen in time. "This place," one of the workers whispered. "It looks like they just walked out." But they all knew that was impossible, because the door had been locked. From the outside, the owner stepped inside first. The floor creaked under his weight, but it held. The workers followed slowly. Each step stirred dust that had not been disturbed in decades. They looked at the table, at the bed, at the walls, and then one of the workers noticed something. "Sir," he said quietly, pointing toward the floor near the back wall. "There's something there." At first, it just looked like a dark shape on the floor. But as they stepped closer, they realized it was a door. Not a door in the wall. A door in the floor. A small wooden hatch, half hidden under a rug that had almost turned to dust. The owner knelt down and pulled the rug aside. The hatch had a handle, and just like the front door, it had a lock. But this lock was on the outside too. No one spoke for a long time, because now the story had changed again. The cabin had been locked from the outside, and whatever was under the floor had also been locked from the outside. The owner looked at the workers, then at the lock, then back at the workers. "Open it," he said quietly. And that was the moment they realized. The real secret of the cabin had never been in the room they were standing in. It had been hidden, under the house. For 40 years, for 40 years, the secret had not been in the walls. It had not been in the silence. It had not even been behind the locked front door. It had been below, hidden, buried, waiting. And now, for the first time in 4 decades, someone was about to open it. The wooden hatch in the floor looked older than everything else in the cabin. Not just aged by time, but placed there with intention, carefully, deliberately, and just like the front door, it had been locked from the outside. That detail alone made the air inside the cabin feel heavier, because now there were 2 locks, one on the front door, and one on whatever was hidden beneath the floor. 2 barriers, 2 decisions, 2 moments in time where someone had chosen to close something and never return. The owner stood over the hatch, staring at it for a long moment. The workers did not move. No one spoke, because even without opening it, they already understood something important. Whatever was under that floor had been meant to stay there. Open it, the owner said quietly. But this time, no one moved immediately. Breaking the first lock had felt like opening an old building. Breaking this one felt like crossing a line. One of the workers stepped forward slowly, holding the same hammer he had used on the door. He knelt down beside the hatch. For a moment, his hand hovered over the lock. Then he struck it. The sound was sharper this time, louder, as if the cabin itself reacted to it. He struck it again. The metal cracked slightly, and on the 3rd strike, the lock broke. But this time no one rushed. No one reached for the handle, because now there was nowhere else for the truth to hide. The owner leaned down and lifted the hatch. It opened with resistance, wood scraping against wood, a slow, dragging sound. And then, darkness. Not the kind of darkness you see at night. Not the kind your eyes adjust to. This was different. Heavy. Still. Like a space that had been closed off from the world for too long. There were wooden steps leading down. Narrow, steep, and covered in dust. No light reached the bottom. Bring the lantern, the owner said. One of the workers lit the lantern with unsteady hands and held it near the opening. The light pushed into the darkness slowly, revealing shapes, walls, a small space beneath the cabin, and something else, something on the ground. At first, it was hard to understand what they were seeing, because the mind does not immediately accept certain things. It looks for easier explanations, safer ones. But as the lantern light grew stronger, the truth became clearer and heavier. There were 3 figures, still, unmoving, lying close to each other. The worker holding the lantern froze. No, he whispered. No one corrected him, because there was nothing to correct. The owner said nothing for a long time. Then finally, quietly, "We're going down." The steps creaked under their weight as they descended one by one. The air below was colder, tighter, and carried a smell that had long since faded into something dry and empty. The 3 bodies had been there for 40 years. Time had changed them, reduced them, but not erased them. One was larger, the man. One smaller, the woman. And between them, the smallest, the child. They were positioned close together, not scattered, not thrown, but held near one another, as if, in their final moments, they had chosen to stay together. The lantern light moved slowly across the room. There were no signs of violence, no broken furniture, no blood, no struggle, just a small enclosed space, and 3 people who had never left it. On one side of the room, near the wall, there was something else, a small wooden box. The owner stepped toward it carefully, as if the ground itself might give way beneath him. He knelt down and opened it. Inside were a few objects, a folded cloth, a small toy, and a bundle of papers, old, fragile, but still intact. The owner picked up the papers and unfolded them slowly. The first few pages were blank, then writing, faded, but readable. It was a letter, written by hand, the ink uneven in places, as if the person writing it had not been steady. The owner began to read, not out loud at first, just to himself, but as he continued, his expression changed. And after a moment, he began to read aloud. "If anyone finds this, then it means no one came in time." The room fell completely silent. We did not leave this cabin. We were placed here. The workers looked at each other. No one spoke. The sickness started in town. They said it would spread. They said we had been exposed. The owner paused for a moment, then continued. They told us this was for our safety, that we would stay here until it passed, that they would bring food, that they would return. The lantern flickered slightly. They locked the door from the outside. One of the workers stepped back slightly. Days passed, then more days. No one came. The owner's voice slowed. We called out. No one answered. Another pause, longer this time. We heard people near the road once, but they did not come close. The room felt smaller now. We moved below when the air became too heavy. It is cooler here. The owner's hand tightened around the paper. If this sickness takes us, then let it be known. His voice dropped slightly. We were not forgotten. We were left. Silence filled the space completely. The owner lowered the paper slowly. No one moved. No one spoke, because the truth was now clear. The family had not disappeared. They had not run. They had not been attacked. They had been locked inside, quarantined, left, and never returned for. The scream in the storm, the light in the darkness. It had not been something mysterious. It had been something human, desperate, and unheard. The lock on the door had never been meant to protect the outside world. It had been meant to keep the sickness in. But in doing so, it had kept the people in as well. And when no one came back, the cabin became their final place. The owner folded the letter carefully. His face was no longer curious. It was heavy, because now the story was no longer a mystery. It was a truth, a quiet, painful truth that had been hidden for 40 years. Not because it was unknown, but because no one had come back to face it. The cabin was closed again that day, but not locked. Not anymore, because some things are not meant to be hidden forever, and some truths, no matter how long they stay buried, eventually find their way back to the surface. The cabin had stayed closed for 40 years, not because of fear, not because of superstition, but because of a decision made in a moment of fear, that turned into a silence that lasted generations. And now, that silence was finally broken, but the story would never be forgotten again. Before we open what was hidden under that cabin for 40 years, make sure you subscribe. Because stories like this are not taught in history books, they are hidden in places people stopped looking. In the end, the story of the cabin was never just about a locked door. It was about silence. For 40 years, that cabin stood at the end of an empty road, untouched, avoided, and forgotten by most of the world. Generations passed, people came and went, and the land itself changed. But the cabin did not. It remained exactly as it had been left, as if time itself had stopped at that door. What made the story unsettling was not just that the family disappeared. It was how they disappeared. No footprints, no witnesses, no explanation, only a scream in the night, a light in the darkness, and a door locked from the outside. For decades, people chose not to ask questions, because sometimes not knowing feels safer than the truth. But when the door was finally opened after 40 years, the mystery did not disappear. It deepened. The cabin was not empty. It was preserved, like a moment frozen in time, a table left behind, a chair pulled away, a life interrupted without warning, and then the discovery beneath the floor. A second lock, a hidden space, a place no one had seen for decades. That was the moment everything changed, because now the question was no longer, what happened to the family? The question became, what was hidden and why was it locked away? The truth, whatever it is, does not disappear with time. It waits. It settles into walls, into floors, into silence. And sometimes it waits for someone willing to open the door. The cabin stood closed for 40 years, not because it was forgotten, but because it was meant to be. Meant to keep something inside. Meant to keep something hidden. And when that door finally opened, it did not bring answers. It brought something far more dangerous. The beginning of the truth. Because some places are not abandoned. Some places are sealed. And some stories are not lost. They are locked away, waiting for someone brave enough to uncover what was never meant to be found. This was not just a story about a cabin. It was a story about secrets, silence, and something that was never meant to be found. If you want to see more dark and forgotten history stories, subscribe to Shadows of History, and I will see you in the next story.